That night, dinner was supposed to be the glorious final night of my life. Instead, it nearly became the last night I was sober. I'd spent 38 years building it all. And in just one dinner, the woman sitting next to my son deliberately put something in my plate, right in front of dozens of witnesses. She thought I didn't see. She was wrong. If you want to know what really happened that night, stay tuned. Hit like and comment the name of the city you're viewing from, so I know how far the story has come. A story told in the voice of Evelyn Brooks. I want to tell you something that nobody talks about when they hand you a retirement plaque. Nobody warns you about the silence that comes after, not the peaceful kind. The kind where you finally sit down after a long day and the house is quiet and you can hear yourself breathe. No, I mean the other kind. The kind where you start to notice things you were too busy to see before. The kind where you replay conversations that felt wrong and you finally have enough time to understand why they felt wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. On the night of June 14th, inside the banquet hall of the Harrington Hotel, surrounded by people who claimed to love me. The room was beautiful, I'll give them that, whoever booked the venue, and I later found out it was Vanessa who insisted on the Harrington specifically, which should have told me something, had chosen gold and ivory as the color scheme. There were tall centerpieces made of white roses and eucalyptus. The lighting was warm, soft, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look 10 years younger and 10 pounds lighter and somehow more trustworthy than they actually are. I remember standing at the entrance to the hall for just a moment before anyone saw me. I needed that moment. 38 years in child welfare advocacy doesn't end with a bow. It ends with paperwork and handover meetings and a dozen conversations you aren't fully present for because some part of you is already gone. I was tired. Not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep fixes. The deep kind, the kind that lives in your joints and your quiet moments. But I straightened my dress, the navy blue one, the one my sister Margaret had sent from Savannah, with a note that said, "You earned this, Evie." And I walked through those doors with my chin up, because that is what Evelyn Brooks does. There she is. The voice belonged to Don Castillo, who had been my supervisor for 11 of my 38 years and who had the energy of a golden retriever regardless of the occasion. He crossed the room with his arms already open, and I let him hug me. And I laughed at something he said that I couldn't quite hear over the music, and I smiled. I smiled at everyone. That was the thing about that night. I spent most of it smiling in a way that felt slightly separate from my body, like I was performing Evelyn Brooks, retiring employee, for an audience I hadn't agreed to entertain. The dinner was set for 7:30. Before that, there was cocktail hour, which really means an hour of standing with a glass of sparkling water. I'd stopped drinking alcohol 3 years ago, a decision I made quietly and without ceremony, the way I made most of my serious decisions, while people rotate through you like a carousel. Evelyn, you look wonderful. 38 years, can you believe it? What are you going to do with yourself now? That last one was the question that made something tighten in my chest every time. What are you going to do with yourself now? As if without the job, without the title, without the schedule that had structured every day since I was 24 years old, I might simply evaporate, dissolve, become some version of myself that didn't know what to do with her hands. I answered the question the same way each time. I have plans. I have my garden. I have my reading. I have a trip to Portugal. I've been putting off for 6 years and I'm finally going to take it. People nodded and smiled and moved on. I refilled my water glass and looked around for Ryan. Ethan. My son was 34 years old and had his father's jawline and on good days his father's laugh, which was the kind of laugh that started low in the chest and grew until it took over the whole room. Thomas had been gone for 11 years. I had learned to carry that in a way that didn't show, mostly, but there were moments, like watching Ryan across a crowded room, when the weight of it came back all at once. Ryan was talking to Gerald from accounting and Martin Peel, who had been on the board of the agency for 20 years, and he was nodding in a way that looked engaged, but that I recognized from 3 decades of motherhood as the nod of a man who is partly somewhere else. He caught my eye across the room and raised his glass. I raised mine back, and then I looked at the woman standing next to him, Vanessa. I want to be honest with you here, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I had not always disliked Vanessa Carr. In the beginning, in the early days of her and Ryan's relationship, almost 4 years ago now, I had been genuinely glad for her. Ryan had been lonely in that particular way that capable, driven men sometimes are, surrounded by people, but not truly known by anyone. He worked long hours in commercial real estate. He had acquaintances the way he had dress shirts, many of them well-maintained, interchangeable. He did not, as far as I could see, have anyone who knew what he sounded like when something actually hurt him. Then he brought home Vanessa. She was polished. That was the first word that came to mind. Polished the way an expensive countertop is polished. Smooth, reflective, without a single pore visible. She had dark hair cut in a way that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She said the right things. She complimented my home in a way that felt observational rather than flattering. She asked about my work with what seemed like genuine curiosity. I told myself I was being suspicious because I was his mother. I told myself I was holding her to an impossible standard because no one was ever going to be quite right for my son in my eyes. I told myself a lot of things. Mom. Ryan was suddenly beside me, and I blinked back to the room, the golden ivory, the string quartet playing something I almost recognized. He kissed my cheek. You look great. You okay? You were doing the thing. What thing? The thing where you stare into the middle distance like you're calculating something. I'm always calculating something, I said. That's why they're throwing me a party. He laughed, and it was his father's laugh for just a second, and I had to look away. Vanessa's talking to her mom over by the bar, he said, tilting his head in that direction. Come say hi. I'll make my way over, I said. He studied me for a moment with those eyes of his that had always seen more than I gave him credit for. You sure you're good? Ryan, it's my retirement party. I am spectacular. He squeezed my arm and moved back into the crowd. I turned and looked toward the bar. Patricia Carr was 61 years old, and in the 2 years since I'd met her, had never once made me feel entirely comfortable. That wasn't a dramatic statement, it was just the truth. Some people have a quality about them that is difficult to name, a sharpness beneath the social warmth, a habit of listening to you that feels less like interest and more like cataloging. Patricia had that quality. She was a small woman, compact and well-dressed, with a way of carrying herself that suggested she had never, not once, been caught off guard in public. She was Vanessa's mother in the way that a blueprint is the mother of a building. You could see exactly where the daughter had come from. Tonight, she was wearing a pale green dress and speaking to Vanessa in a low voice that stopped when I approached. Evelyn? Patricia turned with a smile that arrived exactly on time. The woman of the hour, you must be so relieved. Relieved was an interesting word choice. Happy? I said. I'd say happy. Of course. She reached out and touched my arm briefly. Though I imagine it's bittersweet, 38 years is a long time. It must feel strange to just let go. I'm not letting go of anything, I said, keeping my voice pleasant. I'm choosing what comes next. Vanessa smiled from beside her mother. That's such a great way to think about it. She tilted her head slightly. You're so sharp, Evelyn. Ryan always says you've still got it. Still got it. I filed that phrase next to 17 others I had been filing over the past 8 months. Sang. Here is what I need to tell you about those 8 months, because without this, the rest of the story doesn't make sense. It started small. Almost everything that matters does. It was a Sunday in October, 7 or 8 months before the retirement party, and Ryan and Vanessa had come for dinner. I made pot roast because it was what Thomas used to request every birthday, which meant I had made it so many times I could do it without thinking, which on tired Sundays was exactly what I needed. At some point during dinner, I think we were talking about the house, about a crack I'd noticed in the foundation of the sunroom. Vanessa said something, casually, conversationally, the way you slip a needle in between the joints. You know, Ryan and I were talking, she said, setting down her fork, in a way that suggested the talking had been more deliberate than she was letting on. And we really think it might be time to start thinking about the future. Like, practically thinking about it. I looked at her. Ryan was looking at his plate. Meaning, I said. Meaning this house is a lot for one person, Salmaine, she said. And with retirement coming up, it might be worth thinking about, I don't know, downsizing or options. Communities. There are some really lovely ones now, not like they used to be. I was quiet for a moment. I'm 63 years old, I said. I have a mortgage-free home I've lived in for 22 years. A retirement fund I've been building since I was 28 and a full calendar. I don't need a community. Vanessa smiled. Of course, it was just a thought. Ryan said nothing. I noted that he said nothing. That was October. In November, Ryan mentioned, casually over the phone, that Vanessa thought it might be a good idea for him to have power of attorney, just in case, as a precaution. You know how these things go, Mom. Better to have it set up before anything happens. I told him I'd think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it carefully, and then I called my attorney, a woman named Claire Okafor, who had handled my estate planning since I was 45. And I told her what was happening. Claire listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I valued most about her. And when I was finished, she said very carefully, Evelyn, do not sign anything, and start keeping notes. I started keeping notes. December through March was a slow accumulation. Comments about my memory, most of them from Vanessa, delivered with a sympathetic tilt of her head. Ryan mentioned you forgot about the dinner last week. Is everything okay? Memory stuff can start so gradually. I had not forgotten the dinner. I had cancelled it because I had a migraine, which I had texted Ryan about directly. Questions about my investments, about my financial advisor, about whether I had really looked at my long-term care options. A suggestion that I see a doctor about the fatigue I'd mentioned once in passing, while describing a long week at work. Each one alone was nothing. Each one alone was the kind of thing a concerned daughter-in-law might say. Together they were something else. Together they were a pattern with a direction. I noted them all. What I noticed increasingly was this. Ryan never initiated these conversations. But he never stopped them either. He sat in them the way a person sits in water that is too warm. Not swimming, not drowning, just there. Uncomfortable enough to shift in his seat, not uncomfortable enough to stand up and leave. That hurt in a way I did not write in my notes. Some things you carry differently. Damn. By the time the retirement party arrived, I was not naive. I was not confused. I was, if anything, acutely alert in a way that 38 years of working with vulnerable people and the systems that were supposed to protect them had made me. I knew what financial elder abuse looked like. I had filed reports about it. I had sat across tables from families where it had happened and tried to explain to social workers that intent was difficult to prove, but pattern was not. I knew the pattern. I just didn't know the timeline yet. The dinner was served at 7:40, 10 minutes late because one of the wait staff had mixed up a dietary restriction order, and there was a brief, muffled crisis in the kitchen that rippled through the room as a collective shifting of chairs and checking of phones. I was seated at the head table. To my left, Don Castillo and his wife, Bev. To my right, Ryan. And then Vanessa, and then Patricia. In the chair that Vanessa had quietly rearranged from across the table when she'd arrived early enough to adjust the seating chart. I had noticed her do that. I had watched from across the room while speaking to the agency director, and I had watched Vanessa pick up the small folded name cards, Patricia's and another colleague's, and switch them without hesitation. Efficient, unhurried, like she'd planned for it. At the time, I had not understood why. Later, I would. The soup arrived first. A cream of roasted tomato that was genuinely good. I remember thinking that specifically. Genuinely good. Not just hotel banquet catering good, but actually warm and rounded and well seasoned. Conversation moved around the table easily. Don was holding court about a conference he'd attended in Denver. Bev was asking Ryan about his firm. Vanessa was speaking to her mother in that low, intimate way that excluded everyone else, not through rudeness, but through frequency. Something private happening at a register just below the social noise. I was watching. I had become, over those 8 months, very good at watching. It was the salad course when I first felt it. Not a thought, more like a physical sensation. The kind your body sends before your mind catches up. A prickling across the back of my neck. I had set my fork down to reach for my water glass, and in doing so my elbow had shifted the small silver dessert spoon that had been placed to the right of my plate. The spoon moved, and its curved surface caught the light from the chandelier above, and for just a fraction of a second it acted like a mirror. A convex, imperfect, funhouse mirror, but a mirror, and in that curved surface I saw a reflection. Vanessa's hand, moving, lowering, toward my plate. The image was distorted, compressed by the spoon's curve the way reflections always are, but I had spent 38 years reading ambiguous information and making calls. I had spent 3 decades looking at situations other people dismissed as complicated and asking, what is actually happening here? And I knew what I saw. I did not gasp. I did not turn. I did not react. I brought my water glass to my lips and took a sip and set it back down and smiled at something Don was saying across the table. And in my peripheral vision, I watched Vanessa settle back into her chair with the smooth, unhurried movement of someone who has just completed a task. She reached for her own wine glass. She took a sip. She smiled at her mother and she waited. My mind was very, very quiet, not the quiet of shock, not the quiet of fear, the quiet of a person who has been preparing without fully knowing it for exactly this kind of moment. I looked at my plate, the chicken, the roasted vegetables, the small artfully placed portion of herb-crusted potato, and then I looked at Patricia Carr's plate, positioned to Vanessa's left. Patricia had gotten up from the table a moment ago, not long, maybe 40 seconds, to greet someone who had called her name from a neighboring table. Her chair was empty. Her plate was untouched. The plates were identical, same portion, same arrangement. The hotel kitchen had been precise tonight. I picked up my fork. I cut a small piece of chicken. I made a show of chewing it thoughtfully, the way you do when you are a guest at a dinner and want to appear engaged in the food rather than in the rapidly assembling architecture of a decision. I set my fork down. I reached for my napkin, and in the motion of reaching asai, in the natural, unremarkable gesture of a woman adjusting her napkin, I moved my plate. I slid it slightly to the left. Into Patricia Carr's position, I pulled Patricia's plate, the untouched one, arranged identically, into my space in front of me. 14 seconds. That was all. Vanessa was talking to Ryan. Patricia was still standing 3 feet away, laughing at something with a woman in a red dress. Don was reaching for the bread basket nobody saw. I picked up my fork again and I ate. Here is the part that I have returned to many times since that night. In the quiet of my house, with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside me. I don't know precisely what Vanessa put in that food. I would not know for certain until 10 days later when the toxicology reports came back. But I had a guess. and my guess was grounded in everything I knew about what the goal was. The goal was not to hurt me, not physically, not dramatically. The goal was to make me appear impaired, confused, unstable. In front of a room full of colleagues, supervisors, board members, and community leaders who had known me professionally for decades. The goal was a performance, a very specific one. Evelyn Brooks at her own retirement party, losing her grip. And if that had happened, if I had become disoriented or said something strange or stumbled or grown distressed in a way that couldn't be explained, there would have been 100 people in that room ready to be witnesses. Witnesses to my decline. Witnesses that Vanessa could point to later. That Ryan could point to with a convincing display of heartbreak. She hasn't been herself. We've been worried. We tried to help her plan, but she wouldn't listen. And then at the party, the power of attorney, the financial accounts, the house with no mortgage that sat on a half acre in a neighborhood where property values had doubled since I'd bought it. It would have been so clean. I sat at that table and I ate Patricia Carr's food, which was fine, which tasted exactly like mine, which was just chicken and vegetables and a small potato. And I kept my face exactly where I needed it to be. And Vanessa waited. I watched her wait. I watched her check her phone once. I watched her glance at me with that particular quality of attention that looks like warmth but functions like surveillance. 4 minutes passed. 5. I excused myself to use the restroom, and when I came back, I saw Vanessa lean toward her mother briefly and say something I couldn't hear. And Patricia nodded. And Patricia looked at her plate. And Patricia, who was 61 years old and had no reason in the world to be suspicious of the dinner her daughter had arranged, picked up her fork. Go. I want you to understand something about that moment. It is not a moment I look back on with triumph. I had made a decision in 14 seconds with incomplete information in a noisy public room. I had made a decision that I could not take back. And sitting there watching Patricia Carr eat, I felt the full weight of that. I didn't know Patricia was going to be harmed. I didn't know how much Vanessa had used, or how it would metabolize, or what the next 20 minutes would look like. I had made an imperfect choice under pressure, the way humans do. And I sat with it. The speeches began at 8:15. Don went first, because Don always went first, and he was good at it. Warm, funny, self-deprecating in just the right measure. He told the story of the time I had stayed at the office until 2 in the morning to complete an emergency placement, and had somehow also managed to bring everyone leftover soup from the dinner I'd never gotten to eat. People laughed. I laughed too, genuinely, because it was a true story and it was a good one. Ryan spoke next. He stood up with a piece of paper he had clearly written and rewritten multiple times. I could tell by the way he held it, slightly too tightly, the edges a little rough where he'd folded and unfolded it. He was nervous. My son was nervous to speak about me, which is a thing that should not have moved me but did. He talked about watching me work. He talked about what it meant to grow up with a mother who believed, truly believed, that systems could be better and that it was worth the effort to try to make them so. He talked about the Saturday mornings when I brought him to the office as a kid and let him use the stapler while I answered calls. His voice got unsteady toward the end. Mine might have too, quietly, where no one could see. She's the strongest person I know, he said, and the smartest. And I hope, he paused, cleared his throat, I hope she knows how much we all love her. He sat down. Vanessa put her hand on his arm and smiled. I watched her smile. I was 3 sentences into my own remarks. Something about gratitude, about the particular privilege of work that means something, when I heard it, a sound, not a crash, not a shout, more like a presence withdrawing from the room, the soft unanimous drawing of breath that happens when something is wrong. I stopped speaking. I turned. Patricia Carr was in her chair, but wrong. Tilted, her head beginning to drop. One hand reaching for the edge of the table with a grip that was already losing precision. The woman in the red dress next to her said sharply, "Patricia," and reached out. Patricia's hand slid off the table edge. The room fragmented. Don was already moving. Someone was calling for help. Chairs scraped back. Two people I didn't know were suddenly beside Patricia, supporting her, easing her down. I stood at the podium and I did not move. I watched Vanessa. And here is what I need you to understand. Here is the thing that confirmed everything. In the 5 seconds after Patricia collapsed, the 5 seconds of pure, unscripted chaos where every person in that room reacted from their instincts without calculation, Vanessa Carr did not reach for her mother. She looked at me. She looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard to become concern, but underneath it, in the fraction of a second before the mask fully assembled, was something else. Something that lived in the space between the plan and the outcome. Fear. Not the fear of a daughter watching her mother fall. The fear of someone watching a plan go wrong. The sirens came quickly. The paramedics were efficient and professional, and I was grateful for both things. They had Patricia on a stretcher within 12 minutes, responsive but disoriented, unable to answer their questions with full coherence. In the controlled chaos of the aftermath, the clearing of the head table, the low, urgent voices, the way the party dissolved from celebration into something shapeless and frightened, I did one thing. I called a waiter over, a young man, maybe 22, with an earnest face and a name tag that said Joel. I spoke to him very quietly. "My plate," I said, "the one at my seat, the chicken dish. I need it not to be touched." He looked uncertain. "Ma'am, we're clearing the—" "Joel," I looked at him directly. "I know this is an unusual request. I know tonight has become complicated. I need you to find my plate, the one in front of the chair with the navy blue jacket draped over it. And I need you to set it aside and not let anyone near it. Can you do that for me?" He looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll take care of it." I pressed a $20 bill into his hand, not because that was what it required, but because it was what I had. The rest of that night moved the way things move after emergencies, faster than you'd expect in some moments, unbearably slow in others. People came to me with concern on their faces. I received it graciously. I asked about Patricia's condition. I was calm. I was composed. I was Evelyn Brooks. At some point, Vanessa found me near the entrance, where I had stepped for air. "I'm so sorry," she said. She had been crying, or had done something convincing in its place. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her voice was soft. "Mom has had some health issues lately that we've been worried about. It's been such a stressful night." I looked at her. "I'm sorry about your mother," I said. "I hope she recovers quickly." I meant neither thing, and both things simultaneously. Vanessa's eyes searched my face for something, some crack, some sign of what I knew or didn't know. She found nothing. "Ryan's going to the hospital," she said, "to be with her." "Of course," I said. "That's where he should be." She held my gaze one moment longer. Then she left. I stayed until the last guest had filtered out. I helped Donna and Bev say goodbye to the catering manager. I thanked the venue staff. I collected my gifts, the plants, the framed photos, the cards, and I stacked them carefully in the boxes that Joel brought without being asked. Joel, who, before he brought me those boxes, handed me a sealed plastic bag containing the plate that had been in front of my chair. He handed it over like he'd been in situations that required discretion before. Maybe he had. "Thank you, I said. "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. I carried that bag to my car. I set it carefully in the passenger seat. I drove home at exactly the speed limit, both hands on the wheel, the city moving past my windows in smears of orange and yellow light. I did not cry. I did not shake. I thought very clearly all the way home. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a moment before getting out. The house was dark. The garden was dark. The half-acre of property that a daughter-in-law I had once tried to welcome had looked at and calculated rather than simply appreciated. It was all dark and quiet and mine. I picked up my phone. I dialed Claire Okafor. It was late. She answered on the third ring. "Claire," so I said, "something happened tonight. I need to tell you all of it." A pause. "Evelyn." Her voice was careful and awake. "Are you safe?" I looked at the bag on my passenger seat. "Yes," I said. And then, because it was true in a way I hadn't fully understood until this moment, "Yes, I am." I had been watching for 8 months. I had been taking notes. I had been careful and steady, and I had not let fear make my decisions for me. And tonight, in 14 seconds, with a spoon and a clear head, and 38 years of reading what people reveal when they think no one is paying attention, I had done the most important thing. I had stayed in control. That was what they hadn't counted on. Not that I would fight back loudly, but that I would see it coming, quietly, completely, and that when the moment arrived, I would be ready. Claire Okafor did not tell me to calm down. That was the first thing I appreciated about that phone call. Sitting in my car in my dark driveway with a sealed plastic bag on the passenger seat and the smell of the Harrington Hotel's eucalyptus centerpieces still faintly on my dress. She did not say calm down, and she did not say are you sure, and she did not do that thing that people do when you tell them something alarming, that small, barely perceptible pause where they are deciding whether to believe you. She listened. She asked 3 questions, each one precise and without editorializing. She said, "Don't touch the bag again. Don't put it in the refrigerator. Leave it exactly as it is, and I'll have someone at your door by 9 tomorrow morning." Then she said, "Evelyn, you did the right thing tonight." I said, "I don't know what I did tonight." And that was the most honest thing I said to anyone for the next several days. I went inside. I left the bag in the car, locked, because Claire had said not to bring it inside where temperature variations might affect whatever needed to be preserved. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment in my navy blue dress and my good shoes, and I looked at the pot of African violets on the windowsill that I had been growing for 6 years, and I felt very suddenly profoundly tired. Not the career-long tired I'd carried into the party, something newer and sharper, the tired that comes after adrenaline leaves. I made chamomile tea. I sat at my kitchen table. I opened the notebook, a plain, spiral-bound thing I'd bought at a drugstore in November, nothing that looked like evidence, nothing that announced itself, and I wrote down everything I could remember from that evening in the order it had happened. Vanessa rearranging the name cards, the spoon, the reflection, 14 seconds, Patricia reaching for her fork, Vanessa's face in the 5 seconds after Patricia collapsed. I wrote it all down while it was still intact in my memory, because I had learned years ago that memory is not a recording. It is a story your brain tells you, and stories shift. I wanted the facts before the story had a chance to settle differently. It was past midnight when I finally closed the notebook. I did not sleep well. I don't think anyone who has just watched a plan designed to destroy them, misfire in real time, sleeps well. I lay in the dark and I stared at the ceiling, and I turned things over with the deliberate, unsentimental patience of someone who has learned that panic is a luxury you cannot always afford. By 3 in the morning, I had arrived at something that felt less like peace and more like resolution. A line drawn in quiet, the kind you don't announce. Whatever was coming next, I was going to be ready for it. Ryan called at 7:42 in the morning. I was already up. I had been up since 6, dressed, the notebook on the table beside my tea, the African violets catching the early light in a way that would have been pleasant under other circumstances. I let the phone ring twice before I answered, not because I was playing a game with him, because I needed 2 full seconds to decide what version of myself to bring to the conversation. "Mom." His voice was rough. He hadn't slept either, or hadn't slept enough. "How are you doing?" Last night was frightening, I said. How is Patricia? A pause. She's stable. They think it might have been a reaction to something she ate, combined with her blood pressure medication. She has a history. Another pause, slightly longer. She's going to be okay. I'm glad, and I said, are you? Okay, are you okay? I turned my teacup slightly on the table. I'm fine, Ryan. You seemed, last night you seemed off, even before everything happened with Vanessa's mom. I noted the framing. Off. I was processing a lot of emotions, I said. It was a significant night. Right. Yeah, of course. He cleared his throat. I could hear him shifting, the way he shifted when he was about to say something he had prepared. Mom, I want to talk to you about some things. Can Vanessa and I come over this weekend? Sunday, maybe? I'll let you know, I said. That was not the answer he expected. I knew because he went quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of acceptance, but the quiet of recalibration. Mom, Ryan, I'll let you know about Sunday. I have some things to sort out this week. I kept my voice warm and unhurried. I'm glad Patricia is stable. Give her my best. I ended the call. I sat with the phone in my hand, and I let myself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, the full weight of talking to my son that way. The deliberate distance, the managed warmth, the words I had not said. 60 seconds. Then I put the phone face down on the table and I finished my tea. The man Claire sent was named Marcus Webb, and he arrived at 8:57, which meant he had probably been driving since before 8. He was somewhere in his late 50s, medium height, with close cropped grey at his temples, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent large portions of their lives waiting and watching. He carried a small hard-sided case and shook my hand with the efficiency of someone who did not have time for social performance. Mrs. Brooks, he said. Miss, I said, not for any particular reason except accuracy. Thomas had been gone 11 years and I had stopped using the married name 7 years ago, and it was simply who I was now. He didn't blink. Ms. Brooks, Claire Okafor, asked me to collect and document the item you've preserved. I'm also going to need to photograph your vehicle interior before I remove it. And I'll need you to walk me through the chain of custody from the moment you first came into contact with it. Chain of custody. The phrase landed with precision. I had spent my career understanding what those words meant in institutional contexts, what it meant when they were respected, and what it meant when they were not. I was grateful in a specific and exhausted way to be in a situation where someone was using them correctly. I walked him through everything: the spoon, the reflection, the switch, the waiter, the bag. I spoke in the same tone I had used for 3 decades in professional settings: factual, sequential, without editorializing. Marcus took notes with a mechanical pencil in a small leather journal and interrupted me twice, both times to clarify a time in detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. You switched the plates, he said. Yes, in 14 seconds. Approximately. I wasn't timing it. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite assessment, somewhere in between. That took a clear head. I've been building toward a clear head for 8 months, I said. He nodded once, like that explained something he had already half understood. The waiter, Joel. Do you have a last name? No, but he was young, the name tag said Joel, and he was assigned to the head table. The Harrington will have records. We'll track him down. He stood. Ms. Brooks, I want to be straightforward with you. The next few days are going to involve some pressure. If this is what it appears to be, the parties involved will realize something went wrong. They'll be watching for signs of what you know. Is there anyone in your immediate circle that you're not certain of? I thought about Ryan, about the way he had sat at that dinner table in October and said nothing. About 7:42 this morning and the word off and the request for Sunday. My son, I said. I'm not certain of my son. Marcus Webb did not offer me false comfort. He said, "Then be careful what you say to him until we know more." That was the right answer. It was also one of the harder things I'd heard in recent memory, and it came from a man I'd known for 40 minutes. I walked him out. I watched him drive away with the sealed bag in his case, and I stood on my porch for a moment in the morning light, and I thought about the word careful and what it cost to apply it to your own child. Claire called that afternoon with a first read on the situation, which was preliminary and cautious in the way that lawyers are cautious when they are also genuinely concerned. What Marcus brings in is going to need proper forensic analysis, she said. That takes time, but I want you to understand the legal architecture here while we're waiting. Tell me, if the substance on that plate is what we suspect, if it's a sedative or an impairing agent, then we're looking at a criminal matter, not just a civil one. That takes it out of my hands and into hands that have more reach. She paused. But it also means things will move in ways neither of us can fully control. Prosecutors have their own timelines, their own priorities. I understand that. The other piece, Evelyn, the financial element, the push toward power of attorney, the questions about your accounts, that's a separate track. What I need from you is everything you've documented over the last 8 months. Every conversation, every date, every name. I have it, I said. Of course you do. There was warmth in her voice, the specific warmth of someone who has known you long enough to be unsurprised by your competence. Can you bring the notebook in tomorrow? I'd rather not have it leave your hands digitally right now. I'll be there at 9. I said. Good, a beat. Evelyn, how are you actually doing? I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'm functioning well. I said. I'm not sleeping particularly well. I'm managing the emotional piece in intervals. That's honest. I found honesty more useful than the alternative. Bring the notebook, and Evelyn, don't talk to Ryan until we've spoken again. I said I wouldn't. I meant it. It was harder than it sounds. And Wednesday came and went in the strange, suspended way that days do when you are waiting for information that will change things. I went to Claire's office. I sat across from her at her desk, which was always slightly too covered in paper for a woman of her precision, a detail I had always found humanizing, and I walked her through the notebook page by page while she took her own notes. She stopped me twice. Once at the November conversation about power of attorney. She asked me to reconstruct Ryan's exact words, as close as I could remember, and I did. She wrote them down and underlined something. The second time she stopped me was at an entry from February, 3.5 months before the party. I had written it late at night, and the handwriting was slightly less controlled than usual, which was its own kind of record. Vanessa asked tonight, while Ryan was in the bathroom, whether I had ever thought about a living trust. She said she could connect me with a financial planner they work with. She said it was about protecting my assets for Ryan's future. She smiled the whole time. Ryan came back and she changed the subject without a pause. He never knew the conversation had happened. Claire read that entry twice. She approached you alone, she said. Consistently, I said, when Ryan was in another room or on the phone or outside. The direct conversations about finances, almost all of them happened when I was alone with her, or alone with her and Patricia. That's not an accident. No. Claire set down her pen. She looked at me with the directness that I had valued in her for almost 20 years. Evelyn, I want you to understand what we may be dealing with, what you're describing, the isolation tactics, the sustained campaign to establish a narrative of cognitive decline, the financial pressure. This is a deliberate and organized approach. It didn't start 8 months ago. This required planning. I let that land. I let it sit exactly as heavy as it needed to. I know, I said. That means someone made a decision about you, about your life and your assets and your autonomy, a calculated decision. I know, Claire. She watched me for a moment. Are you angry? The question surprised me slightly. Not because it was inappropriate, because it was so direct, and Claire was usually so measured. Yes, I said. Not in a way that's going to make me careless, but yes. She nodded. Good, she said, and picked up her pen again. Anger with a clear head is useful. Now tell me about the retirement accounts. Thursday was when Vanessa called. I had been expecting it. I had been mentally rehearsing for it, which is a strange thing to admit. Preparing to speak naturally to your daughter-in-law, who may have tried to drug you at your retirement dinner. But that was where I was. She called at 2 p.m. I was in my garden, pulling up the last of the winter kale, which had gone past its peak, but which I had been putting off dealing with because some tasks you avoid, not from laziness, but because they feel like small admissions. I let it ring once, then answered. Evelyn. Her voice was warm and slightly subdued. Carefully calibrated grief, I thought, and then told myself to be fair. I didn't know what Vanessa was feeling. I knew what she had done. The interior life behind it I was still assembling. Vanessa, how is your mother? Better, much better, thank you. A small sigh. She's home now, resting. They said it was a reaction, her blood pressure medication interacting with something. You know how it is with older adults and medication management. Older adults. I filed it beside the other entries. I'm glad she's home, I said. Me too. A pause. I wanted to call and apologize, Evelyn, for the way the evening ended. It was your night and it got derailed, and that wasn't fair to you. These things happen, I said. Emergencies don't schedule themselves. No. Another pause, this one slightly longer, the kind that precedes something prepared. I also wanted to say, Ryan and I have been talking, and we really want to sit down with you. Not about anything specific, just you've had a big transition, and we want to make sure you have support, that you're not feeling overwhelmed. Overwhelmed, right on time. I'm not overwhelmed, I said pleasantly. I'm actually feeling quite clear-headed. Of course. The warmth didn't waver. She was very good. I had to give her that. We just want to be there for you, that's all. I appreciate that, I said. I'll be in touch about getting together. When I hung up, I stood in my garden with my hand still on the phone, and I looked at the kale. Overgrown, past its best, still rooted. And I pulled up the rest of it in one long, sustained effort that left my hands dirty and my shoulders aching, and some small necessary thing released. The forensic results came back faster than I had expected, which Claire told me later was partly because Marcus Webb had connections in the right places, and partly because the initial screening had returned something flagrant enough to move things along. She called me on Friday evening. Lorazepam, she said. I sat down. A benzodiazepine, sedative. At the concentration on the plate, it would have caused significant disorientation within 20 to 30 minutes of ingestion, confusion, impaired coordination, possible memory disruption. She paused. In front of a room of 112 people who knew you professionally, the room of 112 people. I had not thought about the number specifically until that moment, and then I thought about it very specifically. It wouldn't have harmed me permanently, I said. Not a question. I already knew the pharmacology or enough of it. No, not at that dose in a healthy adult. But the appearance was the point, I said. Yes. I pressed my fingers against the bridge of my nose and breathed. In, out. What happens now? Now we make a decision about how to proceed, and I want to walk you through the options carefully. There's the criminal path, which I've already had a preliminary conversation about with someone I trust at the DA's office. There's the civil path, which gives us more control over timing and strategy. And there's a third option, which I'll explain when you come in Monday. Tell me the third option now. Evelyn, Claire, a beat. The third option is that we use what we have to establish leverage and resolve this without formal proceedings. Some clients prefer that. It protects privacy, moves faster, and avoids the exposure that a public case would bring. A careful pause. It also means that the people who did this face fewer formal consequences. I was quiet for a moment. "I'll see you Monday," I said. "Of course. And Claire, I want all 3 options documented. I want to understand exactly what each path costs and what each one accomplishes before I decide anything." That's exactly how we'll approach it. After I hung up, I sat in my living room in the half dark. I hadn't turned the lamps on, and the evening light was coming in grey and soft through the curtains, and I thought about Ryan. I thought about him standing at the podium at the Harrington with his slightly crumpled speech and his father's laugh and the voice that had gone unsteady when he said "the strongest person I know." I thought about whether he had known and participated, or known and looked away, or whether he had been, in some way I didn't yet fully understand, also managed. I did not know. That was the honest truth. I did not know yet. And not knowing was almost worse than knowing would have been, because it meant that the worst possibility and the slightly less devastating possibility were both still equally real. And I had to hold them both at the same time without collapsing under the weight of either. Ryan showed up Saturday morning without calling. I heard the car in the driveway at 9:10, and I looked through the kitchen window and I saw him get out of the car alone. No Vanessa. He stood in the driveway for a moment with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and his head down, and he looked, not like the version of himself he performed in public, but like the version underneath. The one I had watched grow up in this house. The one who had been 8 years old when his father was first diagnosed, and who had handled that by going very quiet and very still, the same way I handled things, which I had never known whether to count as a blessing or a warning. He came to the door. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd made my notes, where I'd drunk my chamomile tea, where I'd had the conversation with Claire that had started this particular chapter, and I made coffee, which neither of us particularly wanted, but which gave us something to do with our hands. He looked at his cup for a long time before he spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said. I said nothing. I had learned, in 38 years of professional practice, that silence at the right moment was more useful than any question. "Vanessa has been—" He stopped, started again. "There's been a lot of conversation in our house over the last year about you. About your retirement, about the house." He looked up and his eyes were tired in a specific way that suggested this had been a wait for a while. "I want you to know that I didn't think it was—" He pushed air out through his nose, frustrated with his own language. "I told her she was overreacting. When she brought up the power of attorney, I told her it was too soon and that you'd never agree." I held my coffee cup in both hands and I looked at my son. "Did you know what she was planning?" I asked. "For the dinner?" The word planning landed precisely where I intended it to. I watched his face. He went still, a different kind of still from before, the kind that happens when something realigns inside a person. "What do you mean?" he said slowly. "What she was planning, Ryan." I set down my cup. "I need you to tell me what you knew, not what you intended. Not what you thought was happening, what you knew." He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on my son's face since the morning the hospice nurse had called and told us Thomas was gone. The expression of someone receiving information that is reorganizing everything. "Mom," he said, "what happened at the dinner?" And I realized in that moment, with the particular clarity that comes from watching someone very carefully, that Ryan did not know. Not fully, not the dinner part. He had known something was wrong. He had let something happen around him that he had not fully examined, because examining it would have required him to look at his wife and then look at his choices and then live with what he saw. He had not known about the plate. That distinction mattered. It didn't make things simple, but it mattered. I looked at my son, 34 years old, tired, sitting in the kitchen he had grown up in, on the edge of something he couldn't take back once he understood it, and I made a decision. I'm going to tell you something, I said, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. He nodded. Okay, I said, and I told him. Not everything, not the notebook, not Claire, not Marcus Webb, not the forensic results. Those were mine to manage and not yet his to know, but the spoon, the reflection, what I had seen, what I had done in 14 seconds, and what had happened to Patricia as a result. I told him in the same voice I had used for 3 decades when I needed someone to hear a difficult thing without shutting down, steady, direct, without drama, without softening. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Ryan's coffee sat untouched and had gone cold. He was looking at his hands on the table, and his face was doing something complicated and private that I did not try to interpret. Some things a parent has to allow their child to process without narrating it for them. After a long time, he said, "She put something in your food." That's what I believe. You switched the plates. Yes. And her mother, he stopped, is recovering, I said. She's going to be fine. He pressed his hands flat against the table. Mom, I didn't. His voice cracked on the second word and he stopped and pulled it back together. I didn't know she would do something like that. I want you to know that. I believe you, I said. And I did. Not completely, but not with the ease of before, not without the asterisk of what he had and hadn't done over 8 months of conversations he'd sat through without saying anything. But at the core of it, in that moment, watching my son's face, I believed him. That wasn't the same as forgiving him. Those were different things, and I wasn't going to confuse them. What do I do? He said. His voice was quieter now. Less the adult and more the 8-year-old who had gone very still in the face of something he didn't know how to carry. I looked at him for a moment, and I said the most honest thing I could. Ryan, I don't know yet. I'm still figuring out what I'm going to do, and until I've made some decisions, I need you to go home, and I need you to act normally, and I need you to not tell Vanessa that we spoke. He looked at me like I had asked him to do something physically difficult. Can you do that? I asked. A long pause. Yeah, he said, I can do that. He stood up. He looked like he was about to say something else several times and didn't. At the door, he turned back. Mom. He cleared his throat. I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I am. I nodded. I know. I watched his car back out of my driveway. I watched until it was gone. Then I turned around, stood in the doorway of my own kitchen, and looked at the African violets on the windowsill, catching the morning light exactly as they had been for 6 years, exactly as they would be tomorrow. I let myself feel it, all of it. The love for him and the anger at him and the grief of that distance and the very specific loneliness of being in a situation where the people you expected to protect you were the people you needed protection from. I let it move through me without stopping it, and then I picked up the phone and called Claire Okafor, because Monday could not come soon enough, and I had decisions to make. Monday came the way difficult things often do, quietly, ordinarily, with no outward sign that it was going to be the day. Certain things became irreversible. I drove to Claire's office in the kind of early June morning that feels almost deliberately beautiful, the kind that makes you aware of the gap between how the world looks and how it actually is. The trees along Meridian Avenue were full and green. Someone's sprinkler was running in a front yard. A woman was walking a dog that kept stopping to investigate the base of every mailbox, and the woman was letting it, patient in the way you can only be when you have nowhere urgent to be. I had somewhere urgent to be. Claire's office was on the 4th floor of a building that had once been a textile warehouse and had been converted with the kind of deliberate exposed brick aesthetic that said money spent on appearing not to spend money. She had been in that office for 14 years. The paper situation on her desk had not improved in all that time. She was standing when I walked in, which meant she had something to say before I sat down. The DA's office called this morning, she said. Before you got here, I set my bag on the chair across from her desk. Already. Marcus has a relationship with an investigator there, someone he trusts. She came around the desk, which was unusual. Claire was a desk between us person in professional situations. And when she moved away from that barrier, it meant the conversation was going to be personal before it was professional. They're interested, Evelyn. The forensic results combined with the documentation you've provided. They're calling it a credible predatory pattern. Those are their words. What does interested mean practically speaking? It means they want to open an inquiry, formally. She looked at me carefully, which takes it out of our hands in certain ways. Once the DA's office is formally involved, the timeline and the strategy belong partly to them. I sat down, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to think from a grounded position. What are the risks? For you, limited, assuming everything you've told me is accurate, which I believe it is. She sat in the chair beside me rather than behind the desk, which she had done maybe 3 times in 19 years. For Ryan, that depends on what they find when they look at him. If he had knowledge of the plan and concealed it, he has exposure. If he was manipulated or simply complicit through inaction, that's a different conversation. I sat with that. And for Vanessa, team, Claire said, and her voice had a quality to it I hadn't heard before. Not satisfaction, exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular tone of a lawyer who has been watching something unjust and is now watching the mechanism that corrects it begin to turn. It is not good. Administering a sedative to an individual without their knowledge or consent is criminal assault in this state. When you add the documented pattern of financial targeting of a vulnerable adult, and yes, Evelyn, 63 and recently retired and living alone, qualifies legally as a population at elevated risk. Regardless of how capable you are looking at multiple counts. I said nothing for a moment. Outside, a bus went by on the street below, and the window vibrated slightly with it. And Patricia, I said, she's a victim too, technically. She ingested what was meant for me. Yes, which is something the DA will have to navigate. Claire's expression shifted into something more complex. Patricia may not want to cooperate. She may not even fully understand what happened to her. And Vanessa will almost certainly frame it as an accident, a mistake, something other than what it was. She'll say, I'm confused, I said. That's her move. Has been for 8 months. Yes, and that's exactly why the documentation matters. The notebook, the dated entries, the forensic evidence, the witness. Joel from the hotel, who Marcus has already located and spoken with, by the way. All of it creates a picture of a woman who is the opposite of confused. A woman who saw what was happening and responded with extraordinary presence of mind. She paused, which is what actually happened. I appreciated her saying that, not because I needed the validation, but because it was accurate, and accuracy had been in short supply lately. Tell me about the third option again, I said. The leverage path. Claire nodded, expecting this. I've had a conversation with a mediating attorney I work with occasionally. The leverage path works like this. We present Vanessa through counsel, quietly, with what we have. The forensic evidence, the documentation, the witness. We make clear that we are prepared to take this to the DA and that we have already had preliminary conversations there. And we offer an alternative. A negotiated resolution, complete withdrawal from any legal or financial involvement in your life, a signed agreement to that effect, and in exchange, we do not formally pursue criminal charges. A deal, I said, a structured resolution. Claire, it's a deal. She allowed herself a small, dry smile. Yes, it's a deal. I looked at my hands in my lap, at the ring I still wore on my right hand. The one Thomas had given me for our 20th anniversary, moved from the left after he died, not because of sentiment exactly, but because it had always fit better on the right, and I had never seen a reason to stop wearing it. What does that option cost? It costs accountability. Vanessa faces no criminal record, no formal legal consequence beyond the agreement. She walks away. She walks away. With nothing, Claire said. No access to you, no access to your assets, no ability to continue what she was doing. The plan fails completely, but she doesn't face prosecution. I turned that over for a long time. Here is what I want to tell you about that moment, because I think it matters. I think it matters in a way that goes beyond my story and lands somewhere more general, somewhere that might be useful to anyone who has ever sat across from a decision like this one. I was angry. I was genuinely, deeply angry in a way I had been managing carefully for days, keeping it below the line where it would affect my judgment. The anger was legitimate. What Vanessa had done, the sustained, deliberate campaign to dismantle my credibility and my autonomy, and then the act itself, the hand hovering over my plate at my own retirement dinner. It deserved consequences that matched its ugliness. But I also knew what a trial looked like from the inside. I had seen it from the advocate side, the institutional side, the side where the person telling the truth is picked apart in a courtroom, while the person who constructed the lie sits composed and well-dressed and says the right things. I had seen what those processes cost the people they were supposed to serve. And I thought about Ryan. If this went to the DA formally, Ryan's knowledge, partial, indirect, shaped by whatever Vanessa had told him or not told him, would become part of the public record. My son, whatever he had and hadn't done, would have his choices examined in a context he couldn't control. I was not ready to decide whether he deserved that. I need more time, I said. You have a few days, Claire said. The DA won't move without our signal. But Evelyn, she paused, measuring something. There's something else you need to know before you decide. I looked up. Marcus continued his background work this week. Financial records are difficult to access without formal process, but he found some publicly available information that you should have. She picked up a folder from the table beside her and opened it to a single page, which she handed to me. Vanessa has done this before. The page was a printout, a civil case filing from a county 2 states away, dated 4 years ago. The plaintiff was an elderly man named Howard Fenwick, age 78 at the time of filing. The defendant was a woman named Vanessa Lee Hargrove, age 29, doing business under a care coordination service. I read it twice. Vanessa Lee Hargrove. Hargrove, not Carr. A previous name, or a name she had moved away from. The case alleged financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Howard Fenwick's family claimed that over 8 months, the same duration I noted as my own experience, Vanessa Hargrove had systematically cultivated a relationship with the widowed Mr. Fenwick, positioned herself as an essential support, and begun steering his financial decisions in ways that benefited herself. The case had been settled privately. No criminal charges had been filed. Howard Fenwick had died 18 months after the settlement, at 80 years old, his estate considerably reduced. I set the page down on Claire's table. She's done this before, I said, not a question. The settlement kept it quiet, no criminal record, no public finding. Claire's voice was careful and precise. The family received a private payment. Vanessa, or Hargrove as she was then, moved, changed her surname when she married a brief first husband, and continued. And Ryan, I said slowly. Does Ryan know who she was before him? We don't know yet. I picked the paper back up and looked at Howard Fenwick's name again. A man I had never met in a county 2 states away, who had been 78 years old when a woman I now knew sat across from him and decided what she could take. The deal is off the table, Asian, I said. Claire nodded once. She had expected this. I think she had shown me that page precisely because she expected this. Then we go to the DA, she said. We go to the DA, I said. All of it. The forensic evidence, the documentation, the Hargrove case, everything Marcus has. And I want Howard Fenwick's family to know that what happened to him is part of this. I paused. They deserve to know it wasn't just their father. Claire wrote something. I'll make that call. And Claire, I looked at her directly. I want you to find out what Ryan knew, not from me, from the record. I'm not going to protect him from the truth, but I'm also not going to assume the worst until I know. That's fair, she said. It's not fair, I said. Nothing about this is fair, but it's what I'm choosing. The next 3 days were the hardest stretch, and I say that having already had some difficult stretches in recent memory. The difficulty was not in the doing. Once a decision is made clearly, the doing has a kind of forward momentum that keeps you moving. The difficulty was in the waiting and in the particular loneliness of not being able to talk to the people you would normally talk to when you were going through something. I couldn't call Ryan. I couldn't call my sister Margaret because I loved her enormously, but Margaret processed difficult information by talking about it with everyone she trusted, and I could not afford that particular form of love right now. My closest friend from work, a woman named Dolores Marsh, who had retired 2 years before me and who had the kind of clear-eyed warmth that I had always relied on. I couldn't call Dolores either, not yet. I was alone with it in a way that was necessary and also, at intervals, almost unbearable. I gardened. I cooked things that took a long time and required attention. A pot of beans from scratch, bread that needed 3 hours for the first rise. I walked in the evenings, the same route I had walked for years, through the neighborhood and along the small park with the stone path and the old oaks. I let myself be ordinary in the ordinary hours because the alternative was to let the weight of everything live in every moment, and that was not sustainable. On Tuesday evening, Vanessa called again. I let it go to voicemail. The message was warm and brief and said that she and Ryan were thinking of me and that they hoped I was resting and not trying to do too much in the first weeks of retirement. I listened to it once. I saved it. I sent the recording to Claire. On Wednesday morning, I received an email I had not anticipated. It was from Patricia Carr. The email was 3 paragraphs long and had been written, I could tell, with some effort, not in terms of vocabulary, but in the way that people write when they are pushing through resistance to say something they feel they need to say. She wrote that she had been home for several days and had had time to think. She wrote that the doctors had explained what the blood work had shown. She wrote that she was a woman of 61 years who had raised her daughter alone after her husband left when Vanessa was 9, and that there were things she knew about her daughter that she had chosen for a long time not to examine directly. She wrote, I'm not a stupid woman, Evelyn. I've just been a mother, and those two things are not always compatible. She wanted to meet, not with lawyers present, just the two of us, somewhere quiet. I read the email 3 times. I forwarded it to Claire with a note that said, Your thoughts? Claire responded within the hour. Proceed carefully. She may be reaching out genuinely, or she may be doing it at Vanessa's direction to gather information. Bring nothing. Say little. Listen more. I wrote back to Patricia and suggested a coffee shop on the other side of town from either of us. Neutral ground, public space, no particular associations. A place called Halloran's that had been there since the 80s and smelled of coffee and old wood and had booths with high backs where you could speak without being heard. She agreed. We met Thursday at Elan's AC. Patricia Carr in a coffee shop booth looked considerably different from Patricia Carr at the Harrington Hotel. The hotel version had been composed, controlled, the product of considerable effort. The woman who slid into the booth across from me at Halloran's had makeup that was present but careful, and eyes that were tired in the authentic way. Not sad tired, but thinking tired, the eyes of someone who has been awake with something difficult. We ordered coffee. We sat with it for a moment. I'm going to say something, she said without preamble, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it and not the way you might expect to receive it. All right, I said. I don't know everything my daughter has done. She wrapped both hands around her cup. But I know my daughter, and I have known for some time that there was something happening with you and Ryan and Evelyn that I was choosing not to look at directly. Because Vanessa is my child and I love her, and that love has made me... She stopped. Chose a word carefully, imprecise, about certain things. I said nothing. The doctors told me what was in my system, and she said, when I asked directly, because I insisted on asking directly, they told me. Her jaw moved slightly. It was a sedative, and the only person who had access to my food that night. She stopped again. Patricia, I said quietly, what are you asking me? She looked up. Her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried easily, I thought, which was something we had in common. I'm not asking you to spare her, she said. I know that's not in your hands anymore. I assume it's not in your hands anymore. It's not, I said. I did not elaborate. She absorbed that. I want you to know that I will tell the truth when I'm asked, whatever I'm asked. I won't protect her from the consequences of something that was done to me. That matters, I said, and I meant it. I also want to say, she paused, looked down at her cup, looked back up. I'm sorry for whatever role I played in making you feel unsafe in your own life. I should have asked harder questions a long time ago. I sat across from her and I felt the complicated thing that I had been managing for 8 months. The vigilance, the isolation, the careful and exhausting work of protecting myself while appearing not to. And I let it be complicated. I didn't soften it and I didn't harden it. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I mean that. We drank our coffee. We did not become friends in that booth at Halloran's. We were two women at very different points in a situation that had damaged both of us in different ways, and the gap between those positions was real and not going to be dissolved by coffee and honest words. But something shifted, something clarified. Before we left, Patricia said one more thing. She's afraid, she said. Vanessa. Whatever else she is, she's afraid. She grew up watching me scramble, and she decided a long time ago that she would not scramble. She decided security was worth any method. She paused. I'm not saying that to excuse it. I'm saying it so you understand that this isn't who Vanessa always was. This is who she became when she decided that enough justified the means. I thought about Howard Fenwick, about 8 months. About a room full of witnesses who had been intended to see my decline. Becoming something doesn't make you less responsible for it, I said. No, Patricia said, it doesn't. We parted in the parking lot with the awkward, sincere handshake of people who have exchanged something real and do not quite know the etiquette for it. I drove home. I called Claire. I told her everything Patricia had said. She'll be a strong witness, Claire said. I know, I said. She's a strong person. She just spent a long time choosing not to be. The formal contact happened on a Friday. Vanessa was served with notification of the DA's inquiry on a Friday morning at 9:15. I know the time because Marcus called me when it was done, and I wrote it in the notebook, which had become in the past 2 weeks less a record of wrongs and more a record of how things unraveled. There was something important about writing down the exact time. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because the plan had been built on vagueness, on impressions and narratives and the soft, deniable language of she seemed confused, and we were concerned, and I wanted the response to be made of hard edges. 9:15 on a Friday morning. Written down. Permanent. I was in my garden when Marcus called. I was on my knees, pulling weeds from around the base of the rose bushes along the back fence. The work that is never done and is always slightly behind, which had always struck me as an accurate metaphor for most of the things worth doing. My hands were dirty and my back was beginning to register a complaint, and the morning was already warm. It's done, Marcus said. I stayed on my knees for a moment. The soil was dark and cool under my hands. Thank you, I said. There will be a response from her legal team within 72 hours, he said. It may come sooner, and Evelyn, a brief pause in the way of someone measuring, it may come hard. When people who have built a narrative realize the narrative is being challenged with evidence, they don't always retreat gracefully. I know, I said. I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the narrative shifts, that suddenly you become someone who staged this, who manipulated the evidence, who is conducting some kind of vindictive campaign. Those are the standard moves. I've been working in institutions for 38 years, I said. I know what the standard moves look like. A beat of something that wasn't quite a laugh. Right, I keep saying things to you that you already know. It's still useful to hear them out loud, I said. Don't stop. He told me to call him if anything unusual happened. Calls, visitors, anything that felt designed to destabilize. I said I would. He hung up. I stayed in the garden for another 20 minutes, pulling weeds, letting my hands work while my mind did what it needed to do. The roses along the back fence were in early bloom. Coral and cream, a variety called Heritage that Thomas had planted the first summer after we moved in, that I had been tending for 22 years without him. They bloomed every June with a kind of stubborn, oblivious beauty that I had always found either comforting or maddening, depending on the year. This June, I found them comforting. The call from Ryan came at 1 in the afternoon. His voice had a quality to it I hadn't heard in years. Raw, like something that had been covered had been taken off. I knew before he spoke what the call was about. She called me on, he said, after she was served. She called me and he stopped, started again. Mom, what's happening? What did you do? I sat down at my kitchen table. What did she tell you? She said you've been building a case against her for months. She said you hired investigators. She said you're trying to destroy the marriage because you've never accepted her. His voice was shaking in a way that was not anger, but something more ragged than anger. Panic, maybe, or grief. She said you've been obsessed with controlling my life. I let him finish. I let the silence after sit for a moment. Then I said, Ryan, I need you to ask yourself something, not me, yourself. Mom, listen to me. When Vanessa calls you and tells you what I've done, what I'm doing to her, what my motives are, does she tell you what she's done? Does she mention the plate? Silence. Does she mention Howard Fenix? I said. The silence changed quality, became a different kind of silence. Who is Howard Fenix? Ryan said, and there it was. The question that told me what I needed to know about what Ryan had and hadn't been given access to. He was a 78-year-old man, I said, in a county 2 states from here, whose estate was significantly reduced over 8 months by a woman named Vanessa Lee Hargrove, who later changed her name and moved. I kept my voice level and direct. Who then met you? The silence on the other end was long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. That's her, he said finally. Not a question. That's her, I said. I heard him exhale a long, unsteady breath, the kind that comes when something you didn't want to believe finishes becoming real. She told me she'd had a previous marriage, he said. She said it was brief. She said she didn't talk about it because it was painful. I'm sure she did, I said. Another long silence. Ryan, I softened my voice, not as a tactic, but because I meant it. Because he was my son, and this was going to hurt for a long time in ways neither of us could fully predict. Yet, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I need you to understand that. Everything I've done in the last 2 weeks, I've done to protect myself and to make sure that what happened to me doesn't disappear into the version of the story she would prefer to tell. What did she put in your food? He said. It was barely a question. More like something said aloud to make it exist in the world. Lorazepam, I said. A sedative. Enough to make me appear impaired in front of every person who knew me professionally. I heard him make a sound that I did not try to name. The DA is involved now, I said. There will be a process. I can't control that process, and I wouldn't if I could. But Ryan, I need you to talk to your own lawyer, not through Vanessa, your own. Someone who represents you and only you. Why? He said. Am I in trouble? I don't know, I said honestly. That depends on what you knew and when you knew it. And the only way to know where you stand is to talk to someone who can tell you the truth about that. Do you understand? A long moment. "Yeah," he said. His voice was flat, in the way that voices go flat when they are absorbing more than they can immediately process. "Yeah, I understand." "Are you okay?" I asked. I heard him make a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "No, I know, I said. "I'm sorry." And I was. Not for what I had done, but for what he was walking into, and for the particular kind of grief that comes when the person you thought you knew turns out to have been something else entirely, and you have to reckon with what it means that you couldn't see it. That grief is its own kind of loss. I knew that. I'd had my own version of it, sitting at dinner tables and retirement parties and Saturday morning kitchens, watching my son sit in something that was wrong and not quite be able to name it. We hung up. I sat at the table. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel relieved. I felt the weight of every choice that had brought us to that phone call, and I held it without trying to put it down. Some weight you carry for a while, that's the honest truth about them. That night, I did something I had not done in several weeks. I called my sister Margaret, not to tell her everything. There were parts that still had to stay close. But because I had been alone with this long enough, and because Margaret, for all that she processed by talking, was also the person who had known me for 63 years, and who had sent the navy blue dress with the note that said, "You earned this, Evie." She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, like she had been nearby and waiting. "Evie," she said, and then without me saying anything, "What happened?" "A lot of things," I said. "Tell me what you can." So I told her what I could, the broad shape of it, the outline, without the specific legal details that needed to stay with Claire. I told her about the dinner and the plate and the switched seats and the forensic results. I told her about Patricia in the booth at Halloran's. I told her about Ryan's voice on the phone that afternoon. Margaret was quiet through most of it. She asked 2 questions, both of them practical. She made one sound that was pure, unambiguous fury on my behalf, which I found unexpectedly somewhat medicinal. When I finished, she said, "Evelyn May Brooks." "I know," I said. 38 years of fighting for other people, she said, and you had to fight this hard for yourself in your own retirement party. 39. If you count the last year, I said, that's not funny. I know, I'm making it funny because the alternative is something I can't afford right now. A pause. Then, are you okay? And I mean actually, not the version you give other people. I looked at the African violets on the windowsill, at the dark garden beyond the glass, at the rose bushes along the back fence that I couldn't see but knew were there. I'm still standing, as I said. Some days that's the whole answer. Margaret was quiet for a moment. It's a good answer, she said, and it was. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated and more tired and more tangled with love for a son who had let something happen, and grief for a marriage that had probably never been what it appeared to be, and anger at a woman who had looked at my life and seen a target. The whole truth had texture and weight and didn't resolve cleanly, but I was still standing in the kitchen of a house that was mine, with my hands and my mind and my 38 years of reading situations that other people wrote off as too complicated, still standing and not done yet. The 72 hours that Marcus had predicted passed closer to 48. Vanessa's legal team made contact on a Sunday, which told me something, that either they were genuinely rattled enough to skip the standard professional courtesy of business hours, or they were making a calculated move to catch us off balance on a weekend when they assumed our resources would be less available. Either way, it was information. People in control don't rush. People who are losing control of a narrative do. Claire called me at 11:15 Sunday morning. I was at the kitchen table with the newspaper I had not been reading, and a second cup of coffee I didn't need. They've retained Kenneth Marsh, she said, and her voice had a particular flatness that I had learned to read as professional displeasure being tightly managed. Should that name mean something to me? Kenneth Marsh is a defense attorney who specializes in what he calls complex family litigation, which is a polished way of saying he is very good at making plaintiffs look unstable, litigious, and motivated by personal vendetta, rather than legitimate grievance. A pause. He has a decent win record. He also has a reputation for going after the person rather than the facts. I set down my coffee cup. He's going to come after me. He's going to attempt to reframe the entire situation. The expected argument will be that you have a history of controlling behavior toward Ryan, that you engineered the situation at the dinner out of animosity toward Vanessa, that the plate switch, which they will absolutely know about because Vanessa knows about it, was a deliberate act designed to harm Patricia and frame Vanessa. She paused again. And that the forensic evidence itself is either misinterpreted or compromised. I processed that. They're going to say I poisoned Patricia, I said. They're going to raise the possibility. They won't say it outright. Marsh is too careful for that. But they'll plant the question, and they'll use every conversation you've had, every comment anyone remembers you making about Vanessa over the past 4 years, to build a picture of a woman with motive. I sat with that for a long time, long enough that Claire said my name quietly to check that I was still there. I'm here, I said. I'm thinking. I know. They need the plate to be contaminated, I said slowly. Or mishandled. That's the weak point they're going to push on. The chain of custody. Yes, Claire said. Marcus's documentation of the retrieval is solid. Joel signed a statement last week about handing the plate directly to you and the conditions under which it was preserved. But Marsh will probe every minute of every hour that plate was in your possession before Marcus collected it. I thought about sitting in my car in the dark driveway with the bag on the passenger seat. The locked car. The specific deliberate choice not to bring it inside. I can account for every minute, and I said, I know you can. That's what we have on our side. You did everything correctly, Evelyn, almost compulsively correctly. A beat of something warmer, which is not an accident. No, I said, it's 38 years of understanding what happens when you don't. We spoke for another 30 minutes, mapping the landscape of the coming weeks. The DA's inquiry was moving forward regardless of Marsh's involvement. That train had left the station, as Claire put it, and a defense attorney's letter did not stop it. But the parallel pressure campaign that Marsh would likely run, the calls to witnesses, the attempts to find anyone who had ever heard me say anything negative about Vanessa, the potential media angle if it suited them, that was going to require its own kind of management. Don't speak to anyone you haven't spoken to yet, Claire said. If colleagues from the agency are contacted, they should be directed to me. If neighbors, same. If anyone approaches you directly, journalist, private investigator, working their side, anyone, you say nothing, and you call me. Understood, I said. And Evelyn, this is the part where it gets harder before it gets easier. You need to be ready for that. I've been ready, I said, for longer than you know. Monday morning brought the first evidence that Kenneth Marsh worked efficiently. Dolores Marsh, no relation, a coincidence I found grimly amusing, called me at 8:45. Dolores, my colleague for 16 years, my friend for longer, the woman I had not been able to call during the worst weeks because I couldn't risk the information moving. She called with a voice that was carefully controlled and faintly alarmed. Evie, she said, someone called me yesterday afternoon, a woman. She said she was conducting a background inquiry for a legal matter and that it involved you. She asked me if I had ever witnessed you behave erratically or say anything concerning about your mental state. I gripped the phone. What did you tell her? I told her that in 30-some years of knowing you, erratic was the last word I'd use, and that she could take her inquiry somewhere else. A pause, and I could hear Dolores's particular brand of controlled fury, which she had been deploying on behalf of people who needed it since before I'd met her. Evie, what is happening? I'm going to tell you some of it, I said. Not all of it, because some of it is still in legal hands and I need to be careful, but enough. I told her enough. Dolores listened the way she had always listened, without interrupting, without editorializing, with the full body attention of someone who takes information seriously. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "She called me on a Sunday," Dolores said. "They called me on a Sunday to ask if you were erratic." "They're building a file," I said. "Anyone who has known me is a potential witness in either direction. They're looking for someone who will say something they can use." "They called the wrong person," Dolores said, and her voice had gone from carefully controlled to something considerably less careful, in a direction that I found, in spite of everything, somewhat strengthening. "I'm going to call Claire Okafor, which I assume is the correct action here." "It is? And then I'm going to think about who else they might call." She paused. "There are people in our network, Evie. Not everyone knows you well. Not everyone will know how to handle a call like that. Some people freeze. Some people say things that are true but that can be taken out of context." She was right. "I'll let Claire know," I said. She can reach out to the people who are most likely to be contacted." "Good. A beat. Are you all right?" "I am less all right than I was a few weeks ago," I said, because Dolores deserved the truth, and considerably more all right than I was at the Harrington Hotel. She made a sound that was half laugh, half something rawer. "You switched the plates," she said, "at the dinner. You actually switched the plates." "In 14 seconds, I said. "Of course you did," she said. And the way she said it, like it was the most Evelyn Brooks thing she had ever heard in her life, was the first moment in over 2 weeks that I laughed. Actually laughed from the chest, the kind that loosens something that has been held too tight. It didn't last long, but it was real, and real was what I needed. The deposition notice arrived Wednesday. Claire had anticipated it, but the timing was faster than she had projected, which meant Marsh was pushing hard on multiple fronts simultaneously. He wanted me in a room answering questions under oath before the DA's inquiry had fully developed its own momentum, before the Howard Fenwick angle had been formally integrated, before Patricia had given her formal statement, before the full weight of everything Marcus had documented could be organized into a coherent, formal record. The logic was clear. Get Evelyn on record early while things were still fragmented. Find a moment where the timeline doesn't match, where a detail is imprecise, where exhaustion or stress produces an inconsistency, then use that inconsistency to chip away at everything else. I understood the strategy. I had watched it applied to other people. I had sat in rooms where it was being done and written reports about its effects. What I had not done was sit on the receiving end of it. That was a different experience. I told Claire I wanted to prepare thoroughly. We spent 4 hours together on Thursday, and she was not gentle about it, which was exactly what I had asked for. She played Marsha's role. She came at the timeline from angles I hadn't considered. She asked about October and November and February and every significant date in the notebook, with the flat skeptical tone of someone who was not inclined to believe me. She asked about my relationship with Ryan, the history, the tensions, the years after Thomas died, the ways that grief had complicated things between us. She asked whether I had ever told anyone explicitly that I didn't like Vanessa. I had to think about that one longer than I wanted to. I told Dolores in the early months that I found Vanessa hard to read, I said. I told Margaret that I thought she was unusually interested in our financial situation. I never said I didn't like her. I specifically did not say that because I knew even then that it was the kind of statement that gets used against you. Marsh will find the gap between what you said and what you felt, Claire said. He'll argue that you constructed a narrative against Vanessa over 3 years and then engineered the dinner incident to bring it to a head. That requires me to have put lorazepam on my own plate, I said. He'll say you had access to the kitchen. You arrived early. I had arrived early, 40 minutes before the event started, to review the room setup with the coordinator. I had been in and adjacent to the service areas for several minutes during that time. I had not been in the kitchen specifically, but Marsh didn't need specifically. He needed proximity and plausibility. He's going to put me in that kitchen, I said. He's going to try, Claire said, which is why we're doing this. She set down her pen. Evelyn, I've been doing this for a long time. Deposition preparation, cross-examination prep, witness management. I've worked with a lot of clients. She looked at me directly. You are one of the most factually reliable people I have ever prepared. Your recall is precise. Your timeline is internally consistent. You don't embellish, and you don't minimize, and you don't fill gaps with guesses. She paused. That is your greatest asset in that room. Don't let him rattle you out of it. He won't, I said. It feels different when it's happening, she said quietly. Even for people who know what's coming. The room is small. The questions are designed to feel accusatory, even when they aren't. And you'll have the experience of defending your own perception of reality to someone who is professionally committed to making you doubt it. I thought about 8 months of conversations designed to make me doubt my perception of reality, about the word off and concerned, and memory slipping and planning ahead, about sitting at my kitchen table in November, writing down conversations in a spiral-bound notebook, because I was already, at that point, keeping evidence against the possibility that someone would try to take my reality away from me. Claire, I said, I've been defending my perception of reality for most of this year. The difference is that now I have a room and a lawyer and documentation and forensic evidence. That's not worse than what I've been doing. That's significantly better. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. Then let's keep going. Sarkon. The deposition was scheduled for the following Tuesday in a conference room at the offices of Marsh and Calloway on the 11th floor of a building downtown that had floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of furniture that was chosen to communicate that the people who worked there won things. I wore the same navy dress I had worn to the retirement party. That was deliberate. I wanted to walk into that room in the same clothes I had been wearing the night everything happened, because I wanted to feel physically in my body that I was the same person on both sides of this. That the night at the Harrington had not changed who I was, that I had moved through it and was still standing in it and was in fact wearing it. Claire had raised an eyebrow at the dress when I walked into her office to meet before we drove over together. She didn't say anything about it. She understood. Kenneth Marsh was younger than I had expected, mid-40s, lean, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was part of the argument. He had the manner of a man who was almost always the sharpest person in the room, and was accustomed to that being recognized quickly. He looked at me when I came in with an assessment that was professional and rapid, and not particularly concerned with what it communicated. There was a court reporter. There was Marsh's associate, a young woman who took notes with focused efficiency. There was Claire, beside me, in the manner of someone who is relaxed because she has prepared thoroughly, which was both true and a performance, and both things served their purpose. Marsh began with the expected ground laying, my professional background, my relationship with Ryan, the timeline of Ryan and Vanessa's relationship. His questions were precise and slightly faster than conversational pace, which is a technique for keeping people slightly off balance, answering before they can fully think. I answered at my own pace. Claire had told me I was entitled to take whatever time I needed, and I took it. Not dramatically, just enough to make clear that I was choosing my words rather than producing them reflexively. He moved to the night of the dinner. Mrs. Brooks. Ms. I said, a brief pause. Ms. Brooks, at what point in the evening did you first become concerned about your food? When I observed Vanessa's hand moving toward my plate during the salad course, I said. Observed, he repeated. You observed this directly. I observed it in the reflection of a dessert spoon. The image was convex and imperfect. I interpreted what I saw based on the totality of what I had observed over the preceding 8 months. So you didn't directly see her hand. I saw her hand in the reflection of the spoon, which was functional as a mirror at that angle and in that light. I saw the movement clearly enough to respond to it. But you can't be certain of what you saw. I was certain enough to act, I said, and the forensic analysis of the plate confirmed that my interpretation was accurate. He moved on. He asked about the plate switch, the specific mechanics, the timing, the deliberate nature of it. He was building towards something. I could feel the architecture of the questions even before their destination was clear. You made a decision to move your plate to the position of another guest, he said. A guest who was not involved in any dispute between you and my client. I moved my plate to an empty position, I said. Patricia Carr had stepped away from the table at that moment. The plates were identical in preparation and presentation, but you couldn't know she wouldn't return and eat from that plate. No, I said. I couldn't know that with certainty. So you accepted the risk that another person might be harmed by whatever you believed was in the food. And there it was, the thing he had been building toward. The question designed to make me either sound careless about Patricia or sound like I had intended her to ingest whatever was on the plate. Claire shifted slightly beside me, which was her signal that I could object or redirect if I chose. I didn't need it. I made an imperfect decision in approximately 14 seconds, I said, in response to what I had just witnessed. I was attempting to protect myself from a substance I did not know and whose effects I could not fully anticipate. I did not know Patricia would return and eat from that plate, but I also could not ask a room full of guests to stop eating while I processed what was happening. And I could not stand up at my own retirement dinner and announce what I had seen without the evidence to support it. I held his gaze steadily. The person who put something in that food made the decision that created the risk. I responded to that decision. The responsibility for Patricia's medical episode sits with the person who prepared the food, not with me. A beat. That's a very organized answer, Marsh said. I had 38 years to develop the habit, I said. He moved on. But I felt in the room something shift, not dramatically, just slightly. The court reporter's hands paused for half a second before continuing. His associate looked up from her notes briefly. It was a small thing, but small things accumulate. He reached the Howard Fenwick question 40 minutes in. Are you aware? He said, in the tone of someone introducing something he believed would land hard, of a civil case involving a Howard Fenwick of Carver County. I'm aware of it, I said. And how did you come to be aware of it? Through a background investigation I commissioned, I said. You commissioned a background investigation on my client. I commissioned a background investigation on the situation I was in, I said, which included information about the people involved in that situation, including going back 4 years into my client's personal history, including discovering that my client had a documented prior incident of the same pattern of behavior she was directing at me. I said, yes. The room was very quiet. Marsh's face did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness did. He had known about Fenwick? Of course he had. He would have had that conversation with Vanessa before he took the case. But he had not expected me to say it that directly, that quickly, with that much steadiness. He pivoted. He asked about my mental health history, whether I had ever seen a therapist, whether I had ever been prescribed medication for anxiety or depression. The questions were legitimate in scope, but designed to establish that I was a person who had, at some point, struggled with emotional regulation. I answered factually. I had seen a therapist for 2 years after Thomas died, because that was the appropriate response to losing a spouse of 27 years. I had been briefly prescribed a low-dose antidepressant during that period, which I had discontinued after 18 months when it was no longer needed. I was not currently on any medication. So you have a history of mental health treatment, he said. I have a history of responding appropriately to grief, I said. Those are different things. He asked about my relationship with Ryan in the years after Thomas died, whether I had become emotionally dependent on my son, whether I had expressed difficulty accepting that he was building his own life. I answered each question with the same even, factual tone. No, no, no. Here is what actually happened in specific terms with the dates and the context attached. He asked about the notebook. You kept a record of conversations, he said, going back 8 months before the incident. I kept notes, I said, dating from shortly after Vanessa's first conversation with you about power of attorney. That's correct. That's a significant amount of preparation for someone who claimed she didn't know what was coming. I looked at him for a moment. I didn't keep notes because I knew what was coming, I said. I kept notes because I had worked in child welfare for 38 years and I understood what it meant when a pattern of behavior had a direction. I didn't know where the direction was going. I knew there was one. I paused. The notes are evidence that I was paying attention, not evidence that I staged anything. He looked at me. I looked back. Let's take a short break, he said. The break was 15 minutes. Claire and I sat in a small waiting room off the main corridor with cups of water and the particular quiet of two people who know each other well enough not to need to fill silence unnecessarily. You're doing well, she said finally. I know, I said, not arrogantly, just accurately. He's good, but he's working with less than he needs. The Fennec thing rattled him. It should have, I said. He walked in thinking that was his card to play at a strategic moment. He didn't know I was going to say it before he did. Claire's mouth curved slightly. Where did you want to be right now if this wasn't happening? The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. Portugal, I said. I was going to go to Portugal this fall. I've been saying I was going to go to Portugal for 6 years. You'll still go. I know, I said, and I meant it. We went back in. The second half of the deposition was more procedural. Marsh covering the timeline again from different angles, looking for inconsistencies that he was not going to find because there weren't any, asking about the hotel staff and the venue and the logistics of the evening. He asked about Joel 3 times in 3 different framings, clearly trying to establish some reason to question the reliability of a 22-year-old waiter who had done an unremarkable thing and signed a statement about it. He didn't find what he was looking for there either. At the end, he asked one final question that surprised me, not in its content, but in its tone. The professional flatness had softened just slightly around the edges. I didn't know what to make of it, so I noted it and moved on. Ms. Brooks, hi, he said. Is there any scenario in which you would consider a private resolution to this matter? Claire tensed beside me. I looked at Kenneth Marsh, who was good at his job, who was representing someone I believed to be genuinely dangerous to people who were vulnerable and alone, who had spent 2 hours trying to take my reality apart and had not managed it. And I said the thing that was true. No, Ozzy, I said, there isn't. He nodded once with a quality I couldn't quite read. Then we're done. For today. Painting. I did not collapse when I got to Claire's car. I did not shake or cry or exhale dramatically. I sat in the passenger seat while Claire drove, and I looked out the window at the city moving past, and I let myself feel the particular exhaustion of having been entirely present for 2 hours in a room designed to make you absent from yourself. It was profound, that exhaustion. Not a defeat. More like what you feel after running a distance you weren't sure you could run. The thing underneath the tired that is something else, something that knows what you just did. He asked about a private resolution at the end. I said, I noticed. Claire said, what does that mean? She was quiet for a moment. It could mean several things. It could be a standard final probe, check if there's any softness before the next phase. It could mean that he's had a conversation with Vanessa since the DA inquiry formalized, and he now knows something about their position that he didn't know when he took the case. She paused. Or it could mean that 2 hours with you in that room told him something about how this case is going to go. I looked out the window. The Fennec family, I said. Have they been contacted yet? Marcus spoke with the son last week. He's willing to cooperate. The settlement from 4 years ago is sealed. but his testimony about the pattern of behavior is not. Good, I said. We drove in quiet for a while. The city was in that particular late afternoon state where the light goes golden and slightly unreal, and the streets are busy with people going from the place they spent the day to the place they are trying to get to, and everyone is in motion. And none of them know what just happened in a conference room on the 11th floor of a building with floor-to-ceiling windows. Claire, I said, when this is over, when the formal process runs its course and the decisions are made and whatever happens has happened, I want to do something. What's that? I want to write something, not for publication necessarily, but a record of what this experience is like from the inside, of what it takes to see what's happening and hold on to it and move through the system that is supposed to protect you and actually access that protection. I paused. Because I had 38 years of professional experience and a good attorney and a sharp investigator and a sister who could send a dress and a friend who told them to take their inquiry elsewhere. I had every possible advantage, and it was still the hardest thing I've ever done. Claire was quiet for a moment. Not everyone has what you had going in, she said. No, I said, they don't. And that's worth writing down. She nodded. We drove. My phone rang. It was Ryan's number. I looked at it. I thought about the voice on Saturday. Raw, stripped of its performance, asking what did she put in your food like the words themselves were something he needed to say out loud to believe them. I answered, Mom. His voice was steadier than Saturday. Not all the way steady, but more. I found a lawyer, my own, like you said. Good, I said. He wants to meet with me tomorrow. He said, a pause. He said some things about where I stand that were not easy to hear. I imagine not, I said. I just wanted to tell you that I'm doing it, that I'm not standing in the way of this. Whatever happens, I'm not standing in the way. I looked out the window at the golden light on the city. I know, I said. I'm sorry, Mom. His voice went unsteady on the last word, just slightly. I know I keep saying it and it's not. Ryan. I kept my voice quiet and direct. I believe you. That's not the same as everything being resolved. But I believe you're sorry, and I believe you didn't know about the dinner, and I believe you're doing the right thing now. I paused. That matters. A long silence. Okay, he said finally. The word was soft, like the exhale after something held too long. Go meet with your lawyer tomorrow, I said, and then we'll take things as they come. I hung up. Claire glanced at me briefly but said nothing. We drove the rest of the way in quiet, and I sat with the specific, complicated shape of being a mother and being a woman, protecting herself and being both things at once, which was perhaps the most demanding thing about the entire situation. Not the deposition, not the forensic evidence, not Kenneth Marsh with his efficient questions and his floor-to-ceiling windows. The most demanding thing was holding all of it simultaneously. The love and the anger and the evidence and the waiting and the 34-year-old man with his father's jaw who had not known about the plate. Holding all of it and not letting any one piece of it collapse the others. That was what the whole year had required in the end. Not brilliance, not strategy, though strategy was necessary, not even courage. Exactly. Just the refusal to let them make the situation simpler than it was in either direction. The refusal to become the confused woman they needed me to be. The refusal to become, in the other direction, someone so armored by what had been done to me that I couldn't feel the real and complicated things underneath it. I was still Evelyn Brooks, still standing, still in possession of all of it. The car pulled onto my street. The rose bushes along my back fence were invisible from here, but I knew they were there, coral and cream and stubbornly, obliviously in bloom. I was going to go home. I was going to make dinner. I was going to sit in my kitchen with the African violets and the notebook and the 38 years of professional experience and the 63 years of being exactly who I was, and I was going to let tomorrow be what it was going to be, because the deposition was done. The inquiry was moving. The evidence was solid. And whatever was coming next, I was going to be ready for it. I always had been. The call came on a Thursday morning in late July, 6 weeks after the deposition. I was in the garden when my phone rang. Not the rose bed this time, but the vegetable patch along the south fence, where I had been meaning to stake the tomatoes for 3 days and kept finding reasons to do something else first. My hands were dirty. The morning was already warm in that particular July way that promises to become genuinely unpleasant by noon. I had a cup of coffee sitting on the porch railing that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Claire's name on the screen. I pulled off one garden glove and answered. "It's over," she said. 2 words. I stood between the tomato plants and the south fence, and I let those 2 words exist in the warm morning air for a moment before I asked her what they meant specifically. Vanessa's team contacted us this morning at 8. Kenneth Marsh called me directly. Claire's voice had the particular quality of someone delivering something they have been carrying for a while and are now carefully setting down. They're withdrawing. All of it. The counter-narrative, the deposition challenges, the motion to suppress the forensic evidence, everything. I sat down on the low garden wall that ran along the vegetable bed. The stone was warm under me. Why now? 2 things happened in the last week that Marsh would have known about before we did, Claire said. The first is that the DA's office formally integrated the Fenwick case into their inquiry, not as background, as pattern evidence, which significantly changes the legal exposure from a single incident to a demonstrated predatory methodology. That moves the potential charges into a different category entirely. And the second thing? A pause. Patricia gave her formal statement on Monday. I had not known that. Marcus had told me Patricia was scheduled, but I hadn't heard the outcome. What did she say? Everything, Claire said simply. She told the investigator everything she knew, everything she had suspected, and everything she had chosen not to examine. She was, by all accounts, thorough and unflinching. Another pause. She also disclosed something that she hadn't told us before. Apparently, 2 weeks before the dinner, Vanessa asked her to keep a specific medication out of the house. Said she was concerned about mix-ups with Patricia's blood pressure prescription. Patricia thought it was a reasonable request and complied. A beat. The medication she was asked to remove was a different benzodiazepine, not lorazepam, a related compound. I sat with that for a moment. She was managing the variables, I said, making sure the only benzodiazepine in proximity was the one she introduced. Yes, Claire said, and Patricia understood when she made that connection that she had unknowingly assisted in the preparation. Her voice was careful. She's not a young woman carrying that lightly. No, she wouldn't be. I thought about Patricia in the booth at Halloran's. I've just been a mother, and those 2 things are not always compatible, and I felt for her something that was not quite sympathy and not quite forgiveness, but was in the territory between them. She had made choices that enabled harm. She had also chosen in the end to be a witness to the truth of what had happened. Both things were real, and neither one erased the other. So Marsh did the math, I said. Marsh did the math. Patricia as a witness for the prosecution, the Fenwick family's testimony, the forensic evidence, the chain of custody documentation, your deposition, which I am told made an impression, and the formal expansion of the DA's inquiry. The case against his client became very difficult to defend with any strategy that didn't require attacking me, attacking you, attacking Marcus, attacking Joel, and attacking a 61-year-old woman who ingested the drug that was meant for you. Claire paused. That's a lot of witnesses to discredit, and Kenneth Marsh is good, but he is not a magician. What are the terms? Vanessa has agreed to a plea arrangement with the DA's office. I'm not party to those specific negotiations. That's between her counsel and the prosecution. But the broad strokes, from what I understand, include a guilty plea to criminal administration of a controlled substance and 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. the latter of which encompasses the documented conduct over the 8 months leading up to the dinner. She took a breath. The Fenwick family's case was separately settled this week. Again, details I don't have, but the son confirmed to Marcus that they received what they needed. I looked at the tomato plants in front of me, which needed staking, and were not going to stake themselves. What does the plea mean in terms of consequences for her? Supervised probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent prohibition from serving in any financial or caregiving capacity with vulnerable adults. Claire's voice was measured. No prison time. In exchange for the plea and full cooperation with the DA's broader inquiry into whether there are additional victims we haven't identified yet. I had been prepared for this. I had known from the week I chose to go to the DA rather than take the private resolution that a plea arrangement was likely, that the system moved toward negotiated outcomes far more often than courtroom verdicts, especially in cases where the evidentiary picture was strong enough that the alternative was a trial everyone would lose time and resources on. I had known it intellectually. Sitting on my garden wall in the July heat, I let myself feel it anyway. The gap between what justice looks like in principle and what it looks like in practice. The fact that a woman who had done this to me and to Howard Fenwick, and who might have done it to others we hadn't found yet, was going to spend no time in a cell. I let myself be angry about that, cleanly and fully, for about 30 seconds. Then I asked the question I actually needed answered. And Ryan? Claire's pause was just long enough to tell me she had been saving this. Ryan cooperated fully with the investigation. His attorney was in contact with the DA's office from the day after he retained him. He provided everything he knew, including several conversations with Vanessa that he had not fully processed at the time, but that, in retrospect, gave the investigators additional insight into the planning timeline. She paused again. He was not charged. The determination was that his knowledge was incomplete and that he had no active role in the planning or execution. I closed my eyes briefly, not from relief exactly. It was more complicated than relief, but something in me that had been braced released slightly. He's been carrying this for weeks, I said. He has, Claire said, and I think he's going to be carrying some version of it for considerably longer. Yes, I said, he will. We talked for another 20 minutes about paperwork, about a formal letter from Marsha's office that would arrive by end of day, confirming the withdrawal, about a meeting next week to close out the civil elements of the case and review my estate documents to ensure everything was structured the way it should have been structured from the beginning. Practical things, the machinery of resolution. When we hung up, I sat on the garden wall for a long time. The tomatoes needed staking. The coffee on the porch railing was cold. A bird was doing something in the oak tree at the back of the yard that it seemed very committed to. I put my garden glove back on, and I staked the tomatoes. Ryan came over that evening. He called first, which he had not always done in the old life, the life before, but which he had done every time since the Saturday he sat at my kitchen table and I told him about the plate. He called and he asked if he could come, and I said yes, and he arrived at 7 with a paper bag from the Italian place on Clement Street that had been my favorite for 12 years and that he had known about since he was old enough to have opinions about food. He set the bag on the counter and he didn't try to hug me, which was the right instinct. We were not quite there yet. We were still navigating the distance that had opened between us, and rushing it would have made it worse, not better. I got plates. He unpacked the containers. We sat at the kitchen table the way we had been sitting at that table his entire life, in the chairs that had always been ours without anyone deciding they would be. He knew about the plea. His attorney had called him that morning, same as Claire had called me. We ate for a few minutes without talking, which was also the right instinct. There was food between us, which is an old and useful human technology for situations where you need to be together before you're ready to speak. Finally, he said, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly, even if the honest answer is hard. When have I ever given you anything else, as I said? Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. Fair. He set his fork down. He looked at the table for a moment. Did you ever think, during any of this, that I was in on it, that I knew what she was going to do at the dinner? I looked at my son. I considered it as a possibility, I said, in the beginning, when I didn't have enough information to rule it out. And now? Now I know you didn't, I said, but Ryan, I need you to understand something that's separate from that. You didn't know about the dinner, but you did know something was wrong for a long time before that. You sat at tables where conversations were happening that you knew weren't right, and you didn't stop them. You said nothing when she suggested the power of attorney. You said nothing when she talked about memory concerns to my face. You chose not to look directly at something that would have required you to act. I kept my voice even and direct, not cruel, but true. You didn't plan it, but you allowed the conditions that made it possible. Those are different things, and they both matter. He didn't flinch from it. That was something, that he sat there and received it without deflecting. I know, he said. His voice was quiet. I've been sitting with that, my therapist. I started seeing someone 2 weeks ago. She keeps coming back to that, to the difference between not doing the thing and not stopping it. Good therapist, I said. Yeah. A long pause. Mom, why did you let me in that Saturday morning? Why did you tell me what happened instead of... Why didn't you just keep me out of it? You had enough. You didn't need me for any of it legally. I thought about that question. It was a good one. The honest answer was layered enough that I had to take a moment to find the right place to start. Because you are my son, I said, and I love you in a way that is not contingent on what you deserve at any given moment. Because I didn't believe you had done the worst thing, and because I paused, because shutting you out completely would have been easier in some ways and much worse in others, for both of us. I looked at him directly. I didn't let you in because you earned it. I let you in because I decided that was what I was going to do. That's different. You don't get to confuse those things. He absorbed that. That's fair, he said, which was what he said when something was true and also difficult. Also, I said, I needed someone to know. I had been carrying it for 8 months, and you were the person I had always told things to, and for 8 months I couldn't, and that was... I stopped, found the word, costly, in ways I didn't fully account for. He looked up. His eyes were doing the complicated thing, and he blinked it back the way he had always blinked things back. The way his father had done, the same exact motion. I should have been the person you could tell things to. Yes, I said, you should have been. Neither of us tried to turn that into something softer. We ate the rest of our food in a quiet that was not comfortable exactly, but was real, which is more valuable than comfortable in the long run. Before he left, standing in the doorway with the night behind him and the kitchen light making him look young in the way that kitchen light sometimes does, he said, I'm filing for divorce. I told you I would, and I am. Papers are being drawn up. I know, I said. Your lawyer told Claire. I don't know how long it's going to take to... He stopped. I don't know how long it takes to understand how you missed something that big. Longer than you think it will, I said. And then a little longer after that. He nodded like that was hard and also useful to know. Get some sleep, I said. Come back when you're ready. He left. I watched his car until it turned at the corner and was gone, and then I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a moment, in the quiet of my house, and let the evening be what it was. Not a resolution, not an ending in the clean, closed sense. More like a door that had been jammed shut for a long time, finally opening enough to let some air through. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Dolores came for lunch the following Saturday. She brought wine, which she knew I didn't drink, and sparkling water, which she knew I did, and a lemon cake from the bakery on Haverford that had been our shared weakness since the early days of working together, when we would split a slice over case files on Friday afternoons and pretend it was lunch. We sat on the back porch and we talked for 4 hours. Which is what happens when you have been rationing yourself to someone for months and you finally open the valve. She asked everything she had been waiting to ask. I answered everything I was now free to answer. At some point, the afternoon light shifted, and she refilled our glasses, and she looked at me with the expression of someone arriving at something they have been approaching for a while. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "Tell me." "I keep thinking about October. When you called me and said something felt off, but you couldn't name it yet. And I remember I said to you, I said, Evie, you've been alone a long time. Maybe you're just not used to having someone in Ryan's life." She looked at her glass. "I basically told you your instincts were loneliness." "I remember," I said. "I'm sorry for that." "Dolores, you said what most people would have said. That's not the comfort you think it is." "No," I said, "I know, but it's true." I looked out at the yard, at the roses along the back fence that had moved from early bloom into full bloom over the past weeks. Coral and cream, and thoroughly indifferent to the drama that had been unfolding inside the house they flanked. The thing is, the pattern she used works because it mimics real concerns. Families really do worry about aging parents. People really do make difficult decisions about autonomy and care. The language she used was borrowed from legitimate love. That's what made it hard to name. She weaponized the language of caring. "Yes," I said, "exactly. And once that language is in the room, you look paranoid for questioning it. Because the alternative, the person questioning whether their family loves them, looks unstable by design." Dolores was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you want to write about when you write your thing?" I had told her in pieces about the idea that had come to me in Claire's car after the deposition. "That's part of it," I said. "The mechanism, how it works and why it works and what it costs to resist it when you're in it and there's no outside observer to validate what you're seeing. Who's your audience?" I thought about that. "Older women," I said after a moment. "People who live alone. People who are at the point in life where the people around them have started using the word concern a lot, and who can't always tell whether the concern is real or whether it's something that's been constructed on top of their actual lives for someone else's benefit." I paused. "People who are being managed. People who need to know they are allowed to push back." Dolores raised her sparkling water glass. "Then write it," she said. "I'm going to," I said. And I meant it in the specific way that I had learned over 63 years to mean things, not as aspiration, not as wishful thinking, but as a decision that had already been made and was waiting for the practical steps to catch up. 2 weeks later, I booked the flight to Portugal. I had said I was going to for 6 years. I had meant it for 6 years, the way you mean things that you keep deferring because life is always more pressing than the thing you promised yourself. Thomas had always said we would go together. After he was gone, the trip had stayed in my mind as something that felt premature, like going without him would be deciding something about who I was allowed to be. I had apparently been deciding that for 11 years. I booked a flight for October, 3 weeks. Lisbon, and then the coast, and then wherever it seemed right to go from there. I rented a small apartment in Alfama that had a balcony and, according to the listing, a view of the river between the buildings if you stood at a specific angle and were willing to work for it. I told Margaret, who made a sound of such uncomplicated delight that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Finally," she said. "Finally," and I agreed. "You're going alone?" "I'm going alone," I said, which is not the same as going lonely. A pause. "Who taught you that?" 38 years of watching people confuse those two things, that I said. She laughed, the big full laugh that she had always had, and that I had been hearing since we were children together in a house that no longer existed, and I laughed with her. And for a moment the distance between Haverford and Savannah was just geography and not the separation it sometimes felt like. I want to tell you something about the months that followed because I think this is the part that gets left out of stories like mine. The formal resolution happened. The paperwork was signed. Claire closed the file with her characteristic efficiency and sent me a note on her firm letterhead that said, simply, "This was important work. I'm glad we did it." Marcus Webb sent nothing. which I had come to understand was his version of sentiment. Joel from the Harrington, whose last name I finally learned was Osei, sent a handwritten card that said he was glad it worked out and that he had told the story to his mother, who had asked a lot of questions. These things resolved. What did not resolve immediately, and what I think people need to understand, is the interior landscape. The hypervigilance didn't leave overnight. For weeks after the plea was entered, I would catch myself doing it, reading rooms, watching hands, registering exits, filing the precise language of conversations in the immediate access part of my memory, the way I had trained myself to do during the worst months. It was a habit built on survival, and survival habits do not care that the threat is gone. They persist because they worked. I noticed it. I was patient with it. I did not berate myself for still being on guard when the guarding was technically no longer necessary, because I understood that the nervous system does not operate on legal timelines. But I also, slowly and deliberately, began practicing something different. I began practicing the deliberate choice to be unguarded, to sit in restaurants without cataloging who was near me, to have conversations with people I trusted and let the words land without immediately assessing them for subtext, to walk in my neighborhood at dusk and let it be an evening walk rather than a perimeter check. It took longer than I wanted it to. It was less linear than I would have preferred. Some days I was fully present in my own life, and some days the vigilance came back like weather, and I let it come and I let it pass and I kept going. That is the honest version of what recovery looks like. Not a transformation, a practice. Ryan and I found our way back to something, slowly and imperfectly. The way you find your way back to something that has been damaged and repaired. Not the same as before, but functional in a different way, and in some respects more honest, because the pretending was gone. He came for dinner once a month at first, then more often. He talked about the therapy which he approached with the cautious seriousness of a person who had decided to do something difficult and was going to do it correctly. He talked about what he was learning, about the way he had been managing his discomfort by looking away from things, about the particular failure of love that happens when you love someone but cannot tolerate the conflict that honesty would require. He talked about his father sometimes, about what he remembered of how Thomas and I had disagreed, which had been often and directly, and without the extended silences that Ryan had brought into his own marriage, as if silence was peacekeeping rather than avoidance. You two used to argue at dinner, as he said one evening, about everything, politics, money, what to do about the back fence. We did, I said. I used to hate it when I was a kid. I know. Now I understand it was just talking, he said, actually talking about things that mattered. It was, I said. It was also sometimes being unreasonable and then coming back and saying so. That part's important too. He thought about that. I was never allowed to be unreasonable, he said, in my marriage, or rather, she was never unreasonable. Everything was always so managed. He paused. I think I mistook that for stability. A lot of people do, I said. Management looks like composure from the outside. He nodded slowly. We did not become a different kind of mother and son. We became, I think, more genuinely the kind we had always been capable of being, which required, paradoxically, that something nearly destroy us first. I would not have chosen that. I would not recommend it. But there is a version of Ryan that exists now that is more present and more honest and more willing to sit in discomfort without engineering his way around it. And that version came out of the hardest year of both our lives. That is not a justification for what happened. It is simply what is also true alongside it. I went to Portugal in October. Lisbon was exactly what I needed in ways I had not fully anticipated. The city has a specific quality that I can only describe as simultaneously ancient and completely uninterested in explaining itself to you. The hills, the water, the particular blue of the azulejo tiles on buildings that have been standing for 400 years and intend to continue standing without requiring your admiration. I walked until my feet ached. I ate things I couldn't name and didn't need to. I sat on the balcony in Alfama in the early mornings with coffee that was much better than anything I'd been making at home, and I looked at the river between the buildings, which you could indeed see if you stood at a specific angle and were willing to work for it, and I let myself be someone who was not managing anything. It was, I discovered, harder than it sounds. The management had been such a constant companion for so long, first professionally, and then in the year of the notebook, and then through the formal process, that its absence felt foreign at first, like a sound you have been hearing for so long, you stopped registering it, and then it stops, and the quiet is louder than the noise was, I wrote in Portugal. Not the thing I had decided to write for other people, but something more private first, a kind of reckoning with the year in the first-person voice I had been carrying internally, and had not yet put down on paper. I wrote in longhand in a new notebook, not the spiral-bound drugstore one that now lived in Claire's files, but a proper one I had bought at a shop near the Praça do Comércio that sold paper goods with the gravity usually reserved for things that matter. I wrote about Thomas and about what it had cost to carry the house and the life and the career and the grief all at once for 11 years without fully admitting that it was expensive. I wrote about the specific loneliness of being competent, the way that people who handle things well get left to handle things alone because their handling makes help seem unnecessary. I wrote about what it felt like to be 63 and to have someone look at your life and see an asset rather than a person. I wrote about Ryan, about the complicated love that does not simplify in crisis but becomes more visible for what it actually is. I wrote about the spoon, about 14 seconds, about what it means to have spent a lifetime paying attention, and about the moment when that attention saves you. On the last evening in Lisbon, I walked down to the waterfront and sat on the low wall, facing the Tagus as the sun went down, and I let myself think about Howard Fenwick, about an old man in a county 2 states away who had trusted someone and had been reduced by that trust, whose name I had never known until it appeared in a legal document, and who had died without knowing that his story would eventually intersect with mine in a way that helped bring what happened to him into a courtroom, even belatedly, even partially. I thought about the other people we hadn't found, the inquiry the DA had opened into Vanessa's broader history, which Marcus had told me was ongoing, and which I was no longer a central party to, but had not stopped thinking about. The question of how many Howard Fenwicks there were in how many counties, with how many families who had settled quietly because they didn't have what I had. The notebook, Claire, Marcus, 38 years of professional understanding of exactly this kind of harm. That was the thing that sat with me most. Not what had happened to me, because I had come through it with my life and my house and my assets and my clarity intact. What sat with me was the people who don't come through, the ones who are more isolated, less resourced, less certain of what they are seeing, who are told their instincts are loneliness or age or decline often enough that they begin to believe it, who sign the papers, who move to the facility, who lose the thing they spent their lives building because someone looked at them and saw an opportunity, and the people around them called it care. That was the book I was going to write, not a memoir about what happened to me specifically, a map, a set of tools, a thing that a person could hold in their hands and recognize themselves in, and come away from knowing more about their rights and their options and their absolute entitlement to say no to anyone, blood relation or otherwise, who is trying to take something that belongs to them. I had a title. I had known the title since somewhere around the deposition, when Kenneth Marsh had asked if there was any scenario in which I would consider a private resolution, and I had said no without hesitation, because no was the correct answer, and I had spent enough of that year knowing what was correct and staying quiet about it. The title was still standing. King. I came home from Portugal on a Tuesday. Margaret had sent flowers to the house, a large, extravagant arrangement of dahlias and late-season sunflowers that was sitting on the porch when I arrived, because she had called the florist with my keyholder neighbour's cooperation, which was exactly the kind of operation Margaret enjoyed coordinating. The card said, "Welcome home, Evie. Now write the book." I brought the flowers inside. I set them on the kitchen table. I put the kettle on. The African violets on the windowsill had been tended by my neighbor while I was gone and were doing well, as African violets tend to do when they are simply left alone and given enough light. They did not require much. They did not ask for anything beyond their basic conditions. They bloomed with a constancy that had nothing to do with being appreciated or noticed. I had always loved them for that. I stood in my kitchen in my house, on my half-acre of property that was mine in every legal and moral sense of the word, the way it had always been. And I drank my tea, and I looked at the garden through the window, and I thought about everything the last year had cost, and everything it had unexpectedly returned. It had returned to me a version of Ryan that was more honest and more present. It had returned to me the clarity of knowing exactly where my lines were and exactly what I was willing to do when someone crossed them. It had returned, strangely, the sense that the 38 years of professional experience I had brought to that one moment in 14 seconds had meant something. That the decades of paying attention to systems and patterns and the places where power operated on the vulnerable had not been abstract work, but preparation, though not the preparation I had expected to need. And it had returned to me most unexpectedly myself, not a better version or a transformed version, or the version that comes out of the fire newly forged, which is the story we tell about survival, because it sounds more heroic than the truth. The truth is less heroic and more durable. The truth is that I came out the other side still imperfect, still occasionally mistrustful, in the particular way that a year of sustained threat leaves a person, still not sleeping perfectly, still sometimes reaching for the notebook habit when I found myself in a situation that felt ambiguous, but myself, entirely, recognizably, uncompromisingly myself. They had tried to make me into someone confused, someone who needed to be managed, redirected, diminished, controlled. They had tried to take the name Evelyn Brooks and drain it of its contents and put something more convenient in its place. They had not managed it. I want you to understand something if you take only one thing from the year that I have tried to describe honestly and without the comfort of easy resolution. You are allowed to be inconvenient. You are allowed to take up space in your own life with your own needs and your own assets and your own perception of what is happening around you. You are allowed to say no to the narrative being constructed for you by people who benefit from your believing it. You are allowed to keep notes. You are allowed to call a lawyer. You are allowed to sit in a room where someone is trying to dismantle your credibility and to speak at your own pace with your own words until the time is up. You are allowed to switch the plate. The people who tried to take something from me were counting on a version of me that had been reduced by age and grief and isolation into someone who needed them. They had done the work of making me smaller incrementally over months, the way you reduce something on the stove, slow heat, patient application, waiting for the volume to drop below the level where it can hold itself up. What they had not accounted for was 38 years of knowing exactly what reduction looks like, and 40 years before that of being raised by a woman who had her own lines and her own voice, and who had passed both to her daughters with the same directness she passed everything. What they had not accounted for was that being alone is not the same as being without resources. What they had not accounted for was the spoon, that small, ordinary, slightly tarnished dessert spoon, sitting to the right of my plate at a retirement dinner in a hotel that smelled of eucalyptus, that had not been part of their plan. The reflected image in its curved surface was not something they had thought to control, and in the gap between what they had planned for and what they had failed to account for, I had acted. 14 seconds, not perfect, not without cost, not without the imperfect, human, morally complicated reality of consequences that landed on someone who had not chosen to be there. But enough. It was enough. I set my teacup in the sink. I went to the study, the small back room that had been Thomas's and that I had claimed as my own workspace several years after his death. Slowly and without ceremony, the way I made most of my serious decisions. and I sat at the desk. I opened the Portuguese notebook to a clean page. At the top, I wrote the date. Underneath it, I wrote 2 words. Chapter 1. Outside, the October garden was moving toward its end of season state. Not dead, not finished, but in the particular transition that is neither one thing nor the other, preparing for something that would not be visible until winter had run its course and the earth decided it was time again. The roses along the back fence were past their bloom now. By spring they would come back. They always came back. I picked up my pen and I began.